My name is Alana, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Jessie. I use she, her pronouns.
And we're making
Menches.
Making Menches is your home for queer, anti-Zionist Jewish ritual, radical education, and community.
Hello, everyone. We are back talking about another incredible book release. Today, we are talking to Wendy Elisheva Somerson Wes, who is a queer, non-binary, disabled, cat-loving Ashkenazi Jewish somatic healer, writer, activist, and visual artist residing on Duwamish and Coast Salish land. Wes is one of the founders of the Seattle chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, and they have been active in Palestinian solidarity work for more than 2 decades. As a politicized healer, Wes works at the intersection of personal and collective healing with individuals, groups, and organizations. They are also the creator and facilitator of Ruach, an ongoing anti-Zionist, body-based Jewish healing group. Wes, we're so excited to have you and to be talking about your new book, An Anti-Zionist Path to Embodied Jewish Healing. I have it right here. It's gorgeous. You talk a lot about your own history and process of healing through somatics in the book itself, but could you share a little bit more about what initially brought you to somatic healing work and what then inspired you to write a book about it?
Basically, I did a lot of talk therapy as I was working on healing as an adult from trauma in my childhood. And, there's a lot of great things about talk therapy. I gained like lots of insights into my work and lots of insights into my behavior, but I really wasn't able to change some of my behavior patterns. And I also had a lot of bodily symptoms, just kind of an inability to digest food well, some chronic pain. And my talk therapist and I really agreed that I needed body based healing. So I was kind of searching for a body based healer, which was much harder to find at that time than it is now. And in the meantime, I was deeply involved in the Seattle chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, which I helped found. And I started to see this kind of collective patterns and had this desire to really work on the collective intergenerational trauma that Jews hold so that we can start doing the healing we need to do to break some of these cycles that the nation state of Israel really uses against us and against Palestinians. And so that's kind of how I got into the work. The book, it really came out of doing Ruach, which is this ongoing group that I started about 4 years ago, working with anti-Zionist Jewish folks around healing and really putting us at the center of the group. Like so often over time, anti-Zionist Jews got pushed out of groups or pushed into the margins, and I really wanted to hold us at the center and also heal into what we need to heal. So as I started doing that, I started to really feel for the ways that we were creating an example of culturally specific healing that could hold the history of anti-Semitism, which includes exile, displacement, genocide, and violence, and our current relationship to the oppressive behavior enacted by the state of Israel. And out of that, I was like, oh, I think I really want to offer something to our movements that about making our movements include healing and making sure that our healing is political. And I think that as organizer and a healer, I really believe we need to be more effective in our movement organizing. And one of the ways that we can do that, not the only way, but I think one of the ways that we can do that is to include healing as part of our organizing and to invite people into really compelling healing cultures that are simultaneously organizing for the change that we need to see. And obviously, right now, we have to stop the genocide that's happening in Gaza. And we have to stop here in the US, people being kidnapped off of our streets, our friends and neighbors who are immigrants, right? There's so much work to be done. And I'm never saying that healing is something we should go off and do and stop organizing, which is, I think, somehow we think of it sometimes. I'm seeing that the two things are really intertwined and that we want to make our organizing healing and our healing political so that we can have stronger movements that invite people to be their whole self.
Thank you so much for sharing your background. And also just wanted to note how incredibly vulnerable it is to write this book, but also to bring your work into the focus like of everyone's healing. That's an incredible exercise in vulnerability, I would say. This idea that you're bringing in of political healing and not taking space away from our movement in order to heal, but healing within the movement, I think is a really challenging thing that we've all been dealing with when it comes to the time that this genocide has gone on for. And I think many of us felt, okay, we're mobilizing, that'll be a few months and then it'll be end and then we can get through this. And so I have lots of questions in this one question about when this book was written. So was it written before, a little bit before, a little bit during? Do you think it was harder to get published after October 2023? And maybe just generally hearing some of your own processing, trying to write about a genocide that's ongoing while experiencing it in all of our bodies.
I wrote the book and submitted it for publication in September 2023. So I had written the whole thing before October 7th, and I had also submitted it to North Atlantic, who I wanted to publish it. They accepted it in December 2023. And it was, I mean, it was such a horrible time, but it happened in a sweet way, which is in Seattle, we were doing a Hanukkah protest. There were 8 JVP chapters in 8 different cities closing down 8 different bridges for the 8 nights of Hanukkah. And so we were on the University Bridge in Seattle, which we shut down, and the police just kind of left us alone. So we were just in sort of a long protest on the bridge, trying to keep the energy up. And when things had kind of subsided, I checked my email as one does. And I got the offer from North Atlantic at that time. So it was kind of sweet that it was like an activist moment and I was with my people when I got the offer. So then what ended up happening is that I ended up editing it in 2024, and that enabled me to write a new first chapter that was about this moment that we're in. And I tried to go through the book and update it to reflect some more current examples. But I think the thing is that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine has been happening since 1948 with the founding of the state of Israel. And so I think what is happening is so intensified and has drawn a lot more attention, but it's not entirely new. So in some ways, I think if I had written the whole book post October 7th, I do think it would be different. And I am happy at some point if it's useful to talk about what I think might have been different. But I had 6 months to write a new chapter, edit the whole thing. There's no way for me to rewrite the whole book. And I think it's okay. Of course, it's complicated timing, and there were various points I was in my own doubts. I mean, very close to the end, I was just like, never mind, let's let's not do this. But I'd signed a contract, so had to do it. And I think it's hard because there's so much misuse of Jewish history and Jewish trauma right now to provide a moral cover for genocide. So it's like I understand the thinking of like, why do you want to spend more time on that? And I also think there's a reason we want to actually do it right is because Zionism really depends on us being stuck in trauma and not healing. And so we really want to heal so that Jews are not so easily manipulated into supporting something like this genocide or into supporting Zionism. It's not healing that got us into this place to begin with. And so I'm really holding, we have to do everything we can to stop the genocide, and we need healing, and our activism can be healing, and our healing must be political. And there's no getting around this took up my time and energy, and it takes time and energy to heal. And I think those are just some of those tensions that we're holding in this moment. So I don't think it's the only path forward, but it is a path forward. And I wanted to put that offer out into the world.
I do, even in reading it, I think the fact that it felt unclear if it was written pre or post October 7th, like, I think speaks to the fact that you were already acknowledging the very long history of ethnic cleansing and violence that has been ongoing, but that the ways that you edited and tweaked for those 6 months clearly paid off because it felt like deeply relevant, could have quite literally been written yesterday. And yeah, again, just speaks to how this work is ongoing, has been happening, and will continue to be happening. More specifically, like getting into some of the nitty gritty of the book itself in chapter 1, which I think you said that was one of the additions. You introduced this concept of doppelganger politics. And for folks who haven't read yet, what are Naomi Klein and Caroline Rooney describing when they use this term, and how does it apply to Israel?
In Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World, she is really providing this framework to help us understand different instances of this concept of like doppelgangers or doubling. And so our current culture is really filled with examples of this doubling where we split off parts of ourselves, and that this can occur on an individual level and it can occur on a collective level. So we think about just like, in the world of social media, we create these idealized versions or doubles of ourselves, and then we project all the unwanted and dangerous parts of ourselves onto some kind of an other, and that kind of sharpens who we are. So Klein widens this out to the realm of international politics by arguing that nations and cultures also have doppelgangers. So Klein is sort of building on this argument of Professor Caroline Rooney, and she used this term doppelganger politics to describe the state of Israel's relationship to Palestine. And she talks about this in a couple really interesting and related ways, where she's saying in creating the state, Zionists mimic the nationalism and racism of Europeans that had been oppressing Jews in Europe for centuries, right? So that's one kind of mimicry. And then the second kind of doubling or mimicry is projecting criminality and violence onto the Palestinian other instead of confronting the state's own foundational crimes. And it was really using this to make sense of this kind of upside down world that we're in right now, where when we talk about the genocide that's happening in Gaza, the response from Israel is often, no, we're the ones under threat of genocide. And so it was helping me to kind of think about how does that work? How does this kind of doubling work in this case, where the Israeli government keeps portraying the Israeli state as synonymous with Jews and as though we are always about to be a victim. And so I think looking at doppelganger politics really helps you see how that turn happened.
That framework was so helpful for me in understanding, like, sometimes it's just helpful when we have a name for a phenomena, and when everyone around you is denying that it's a real dynamic, it's so helpful to be like, "Oh, no, wait, there's a thing. This is a thing that other people notice, and it's classifiable," you know? So, I was really grateful for that. This question kind of brings us to a different element of your book, which personally was so exciting for me to read. Specifically, you brought in kavanah so seamlessly into these embodied practices. And Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi was like a really strong presence in the second chapter. I love this idea that our embodied kavanah will sustain us and lead us to take actions that align with our values, even under duress, because I think that's such a comforting concept, right? That like if we live with our values, even when we're like, what is happening? The sky is falling. How can we handle this? Our covenant will guide us. And so, can you describe your relationship to Rabbi Zalman's writing or the research process for finding rabbinic sources for this book?
As someone who wasn't raised religiously at all, I relied on some books that were really accessible, and his work is very accessible, right? There's just a lot of trying to make Jewishness and Judaism accessible for people who don't know that much about it or and who want to pray or who are interested. And so I felt like it was a really good fit to use his work in this book in that way. And then I loved when I started reading more about Kavanaugh, I just loved this idea of bringing intention. In many ways, what he's talking about is bringing intention to our prayers, to our lives. And the more I read about it, I was like, but that's exactly what we are doing with commitments inside of somatics. They're usually called commitment, but for the sake of Ruach in the book, I like to use Kavanaugh because it's more resonant Jewishly. So I think there are just some very deep truths that spiritual paths share. And this was an intersection that I really wanted to follow about how do our longings lead us to our path and how that is actually something that feels holy to me. What I noticed was in the way that I was trained in somatics, everything was framed very practically because somatics is, people think it's woo, but it's actually very practical. It's like what's happening in your body and how do you work with it, right? And in a way, I was really missing some of the deeper spiritual stuff because that really nourishes me. Like ritual has always nourished me. Our JVP chapter in Seattle was really born out of doing ritual. And I really love how ritual can hold complexity and so much richness in how we move energy. And so the ways that I frame spirituality in the book is that it really allows us to have kind of a wider perspective. And so when we think about like what I learned from somatics is like, let's feel into our bodies. And that's where we find what we care about truly. And that's where we find our longings. But I think that always left me with this question of, yes, but where do they come from in the first place? And that's an unanswerable question in many ways, but it's a spiritual question. And so, what I really was longing for in my own work inside of somatics is a spiritual framework that helped me land in some of these questions. Then I also, just in terms of finding sources, I also talked to my friend Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg a lot, who wrote for Times Such as These, and she was really great at pointing me to sources. And I used a lot of Sepharia.
I love learning about new Jewish concepts that can relate to something that is happening in the secular world. So when you get into your incredibly, again, I'm going to use the word vulnerable because the chapters about Judaism and racism I felt were so deeply rooted in your family's experience, and it was incredibly refreshing and vulnerable to see that on the page. Specifically, when you're discussing the ways that we must expand our capacity to hold the seriousness of anti-Semitism alongside our capacity to perpetuate racist violence. You bring in the concept of pilpul, which I had not heard of before, so I will hope you'll expand on that. But it sounds similar to argument for the sake of heaven, which is something we have talked about a bunch on this podcast. So how does pilpul apply to somatic healing? Also, what is it? And what lessons can we learn from Talmud scholars?
So, Heelpool is really talking about the same tension that you were describing in the argument for the sake of heaven, right? It's that something beautiful can arise from tensions, right? And that is actually part of our tradition is that Jewishness and Judaism is supposed to be able to hold complexity. And that, like in the Talmud, right, we always have a debate over decisions, and that even when a majority makes a decision, they always preserve the minority opinion. And this is part of our history and part of our culture. And what we find in North America is that we are living in kind of a Christian hegemony that really promotes binary thinking, right? Dividing everything into good or bad categories. And so many of these Christian ideas have just become common sense in our culture. They're the ways that we perceive the world around us. And we don't always remember that these are coming from that dominant culture of Christianity and Christian hegemony. We end up really looking at ourselves and others as either you're good or you're bad, either you're a victim or a perpetrator, either you're right or you're wrong. And this is actually part of the culture of white supremacy that promotes binary thinking, which is all about divisions and hierarchies, and then which is the good side of the binary, and then domination, right? And so, when we are faced with the many contradictions in our lives, many of us feel pressured to choose one side or the other, right? And it's like when we're talking about Jewish history, either our ancestors were oppressed and they were good, or they were oppressors and they were bad. And we know that's not true. And when we do that, we're really flattening out the depth and the richness of our own histories and our lives and those of the people who came before us, right? And so there is a lot of complexity that we need to be able to hold both from history and now. It's like you were saying, it's like anti-Semitism is real. And it's hard to hold that sometimes when there are so many false accusations of anti-Semitism that are being used to oppress the movement for justice in Palestine. And I will find myself sometimes is when I hear about an instance of anti-Semitism, my first go to is to doubt it. And it's really sad. It makes me feel weird, but it's true because it's so being weaponized. It's never been more weaponized than in this current moment, or at least that's how it feels in the history of my life. It's hard to hold that complexity, and we always want to be able to hold it. And so that is what I'm kind of talking about in terms of my own history of being able to hold the ways that my grandparents, I talk in the book about my grandfather who came over to this country as an immigrant and was really encouraged to become white through distancing himself from people at the lowest rung of the hierarchy, which are Black Americans, right? And so I'm looking at his own history and a choice that he made, which I find very shameful, to engage in blackface. And then what I'm trying to do with that shameful history is really look at, even as he had agency and was making a choice, what were the collective pressures he was under that encouraged him to do something that is so morally reprehensible? And how it was part of this journey for him to become white at the very same time that his family who stayed behind in Poland was being killed for their supposed racial identity, right? And so it's just a complex holding of so many parts of history that kind of converges in that moment of blackface. And if the only thing we have to say about it is like, I should just feel ashamed that my grandfather did that because it was really bad, which is a truth. It is really bad. And I actually do feel shame. But if I get stuck there, it's not actually allowing me to turn and face the history and do something with it. So if I'm able to hold the complexity and really look at it straight on instead of hiding from it or just only collapsing in the face of it, that enables me to be like, okay, this happened. And then what are the ways that I want to show up in this lifetime that transform and can heal some of what happened and some of what my grandfather went through and also what he perpetrated? And offering us a way to hold the complexities of our histories and also be able to transform and move with them.
Thank you so much. I think what you're describing is something that so many people, especially in like leftist and activist spaces, really struggle with, which is like how to come to terms and metabolize familial histories of racism and oppression and ongoing enactments of those same actions, whether it
Mhm.
be through like anti-Black racism in the United States or through anti-Palestinian racism in the US and globally. And I think we talk a lot about like how to process and hold ourselves accountable as white people. And I felt like this book offered really tangible tools for how to actually work through some of that accountability. I think like the case examples that you provide help bring a lot of clarity to like the tangible nature of how thematic healing can help us move through these deeply vulnerable and challenging stuck points, shame and guilt. I would imagine other folks reading this would also really resonate with some of the things that the individuals you use as case examples are working through. And it just feels like deeply important work. As I was reading, I was like, wow, like that's resonates a lot with me. And like, I found myself being really curious the ways that somatic healing could support me, support loved ones, support clients, people that I know in organizing and ritual spaces. And so I'm curious, how can more anti-Zionist Jews and all folks access this really powerful tool that is somatic healing?
I think there are many more somatic healers these days. And if you're talking about individual healing, that you're looking for an individual somatic healer, it still can be kind of hard to find someone who also shares like a lefty politics. And so sometimes it means like finding a somatic therapist and working with them and bringing your own political framework. So that's one option because there are a fair amount of somatic healers. I personally believe that body work is such an important part, like hands on body work is a really important part of healing. And so I would recommend finding someone who actually does hands on body work, either through generative somatics, through somatic experiencing. There are folks who use touch and through other methodologies. I think just finding someone you have a good connection with is the most important thing. And then I also think there are more and more groups. Like I really love collective healing. I think collective healing also offers something that gets us away from our kind of individualist mindset in the US of like you just go and do your healing on your own with your therapist. There's such a beauty for me in running groups because of the possibilities of collective healing and how what we get to discover in groups is that the issues that we think are just about what's wrong with each of us are so collective, and that is healing in and of itself. And when we hold healing space in groups, one person's healing really ripples through the whole group. So I really love that can hold our collective healing, and there are more and more healing groups, those kind of spaces as well. So I think those two routes, and then finding ways to be in your body. If you're someone who loves ritual, when you're doing ritual, when you are doing whatever brings you joy and resilience, like noticing what does that feel like in my body when I get to go swimming in the lake in the summer and really increasing your ability to be present for like the joyful and resilient parts of our lives because we are under such pressure right now. It is like such a horrific time. I think we need to bring all the resilience and resource that we can to really fight for ourselves and our lives and those people who are the most vulnerable and those who we love. Like, I think we really need to be resourced. And so, those are just a few things I would recommend.
Thank you. I think talking about resourcing ourselves and finding like what helps us build resilience is helpful because I think something that I've noticed, like I both in the realm of being a clinician and as someone who is looking for support clinically, is that there's a lot of financial barriers to accessing healing, especially this type of healing, because capitalism sucks. And so I think like hearing those ways that people who maybe can't afford to be part of a somatic healing group or seek out individual somatic healing sessions can still like integrate some of this wisdom into their lives is really helpful. And I'm glad that you touched on that because I feel like that's something I'm thinking about often is like, okay, how can I get this to people who need it so desperately, but have the most barriers to accessing it?
For sure. And I think, I think all of us who are political and have been trained in somatic healing are continuing to find ways to make it more accessible. I think the Embodiment Institute often offers practices that are just online for free. And I know in Ruach, we're constantly thinking about how do we make some of these concepts and practices accessible to people who can't afford to sign up for a group or do individual one-on-one work. And I think, we have to also really, like you were saying, like widen out what is our concept of what healing is and what can be healing for us.
If you're listening and you're like, what is Embodiment Institute or what was Safaria when we talked about it earlier, all that will be linked in the show notes so that you can go check those things out. You make a point in chapter 7. I'm going to read a quote from it. You say, when we don't have a way to process grief and heartbreak along with the rage, we can get stuck in a fight response that can make us turn against each other. And then go on to highlight how ritual spaces can help us access our full range of emotions. I think we see this infighting often in leftist spaces, including anti Zionist Jewish ones, and it often precludes meaningful action from taking place. I also think this connects so much to your discussion about shame in chapter 8 and how shame can lead us to over and or undertake accountability. For those of us who are facilitating ritual spaces, how can we move through these fight responses when they arise? And how can we practice this concept of quote unquote centered accountability?
I think that kind of the first step for all of us is that we have to be able to notice when we are in an activated state, whether it's a fight or a flight response, or if we're in a freeze response. Because when we notice in our bodies that we are activated, we have more choice around how to act, right? And it sounds so simple, but actually, it's really hard. And one of the things we want to be able to do is really learn on kind of a sensation level. What does activation feel like in my body, right? Oh, it feels like everything tenses up. I get hot and I like maybe dissociate and leave myself and I feel rage, right? That's a clear, oh, I'm in a fight response. And what I need to do is probably take a break and regulate, or whatever language works for you, like recenter, take a walk, take a break, get support, whatever it is, so that we don't just enter into whatever conflict is about to happen from a place of being so reactive, right? And so some of it is just getting to know, what does it feel like in my body when I'm activated or in the stuck fight response. And it's really hard right now. Like there's no getting around it. There is so much to be angry and rageful about. Like we were talking about at the beginning of the show, it's like, oh, we thought this genocide happening in Gaza, we thought we could end it in a couple months. We thought we could have a ceasefire in a couple months. We thought things would be radically different by now, and they're not. And then it makes us feel so helpless that we have not been able to take down these power structures that enable the genocide to happen. That then we look around and it's like, well, you know who I can have an impact on is like this person who is bugging the shit out of me in my organizing. So I'm going to start a fight with them. And it does make sense, right? Sure, we need to feel like we can have an impact somewhere, but sometimes, like you were saying, it's not the most productive, or it doesn't lead us to be effective organizers. We really need to be able to recognize when we are activated. We really need tools to help us come back to our center. And like we were talking about, how do we come back to our kavanot, our intentions? How do we come back to the ways that we want to be in this world? How do we start building the kinds of accountable relationships that help us build the world to come? And that's what we want to be practicing in all of our relationships and all of our organizing, the kinds of relationships that we want to live into that do something different, that isn't powering over someone and isn't dominating someone, that is actually about mutual interdependence. I think you're asking towards the end of that question about like centered accountability. I think there's a fair amount in the book in the Healing Shame chapter about how do we come into a centered and accountable response, or feel for what is centered and accountable in our bodies. And I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying about really being accountable for our histories when I was talking about my grandfather. I think we need to find a way to really turn and face what is true, right? What is true in our histories, what is true in our present, and then figure out from a centered place, what is my responsibility, both personally and collectively. And with the help of community, we can figure that out. And then we want to take action based on what we feel accountable for, right? And so you were talking about kind of the two ways that we flip. One way we flip is into under accountability, where we get defensive and don't think anything is our fault, right? And shut down in that way. And then the other way we flip is into over accountability, where it's like everything is our fault and we feel really terrible. And the thing about that flipping between under and over accountability is that they're really just two sides of a coin, that they don't actually engender action that changes things, right? So when we're under accountable, it's just a defensive, like, I'm not even going to look. It's like, oh, that was a long time ago. If you're talking about my grandfather, that was a long time ago. I didn't do it. And that's just like a defensive shutdown response. Or the over accountable is like, he was a bad person. I'm a bad person. Nothing to be done. But a centered response is like, no, I'm going to turn and look at these kind of really hard choices that he made that I don't agree with and that I've benefited from, right? What do I do with that? And that is a process of trying to come into a centered and accountable place around my own position in history and my own relationship to power and privilege and oppression. And that it's like there isn't a one answer about how we find centered accountability, but it's in this grappling, I think, that we get closer to finding how can I be centered and accountable both for my history and my current position and towards building towards the future that we want to build towards.
That's such a beautiful segue to the question I want to pose next. Now, this question comes from an idea of like having worked in Jewish institutions, having enjoyed my experience at times in Jewish institutions, having a lot of love for some people who love Jewish institutions and will stay committed to Jewish institutions forever. But the last couple of chapters on Teshuvah and embodied ritual are so helpful for thinking of these like models of moving forward and imagining new worlds and what they could look like. And oftentimes we kind of assume our mainstream Jewish institutions can't go with us, that we have to leave them in the past and we have to just forge new Jewish communities that we can't really imagine yet, but that will be values aligned. And above all else, we will feel safe and comfortable in those spaces. Do you imagine any future in which mainstream Jewish institutions can move away from Zionism and other oppressive ideologies they continue to purport, potentially using these tools?
Such a hard question. I want to answer from a generous place. Like, unlike you, I have had very little positive interactions with any mainstream Jewish institutions. So I think, like, honestly, my first answer is I don't know. Some of them I deeply believe just need to crumble, but I'm talking about like the Anti-Defamation League, right? When their whole mission is Israel advocacy and they've cut every moral, compromise and they perpetuate so much evil. No, I think some of them need to crumble and we need to see like what comes out of the ashes of some of those ones. I think I have less experience with some of the ones that you're talking about. And so it's kind of hard for me to say. I do think we're at a point that in many of the more mainstream Jewish institutions, that more and more people are challenging Zionism. And I think it's like an interesting idea to be like, okay, well, what happens when the majority of people working in some of these organizations are really forwarding something different than what the organization itself, right, purports to be forwarding? And I think we might be at a point where some of those internal contradictions start to split. And it could be a point in which organizations choose a path of transformation. And that path requires so much work. And I think it also is where's your funding coming from? Because often that question of funding is what makes it impossible to do the transformation. And so it's a really tricky question. I don't have the answer and I don't know all of the different formations in Jewish organizations, but I think it is a long road ahead for them to transform. And I hope some of them choose that path. And I have not yet seen that happen.
Yeah, I think Bessie and I are generally pretty disillusioned. And yeah, I remain curious about the ways that some of these tools can be applied in like these very real world ways. Yeah, I think a lot of disillusionment can sometimes be grounded in like idealism for the future that I sometimes get caught up in being like, okay, but what's the practical path forward? Speaking of a practical application, you facilitate Ruach, which we mentioned earlier, which is a Jewish body-based healing group for anti-Zionist Jews specifically. Could you share a little bit more about what inspired you to start Ruach and some lessons you've learned from facilitating that group?
I really created Ruach because I wanted something like Ruach. I found myself really yearning for an anti-Zionist Jewish space inside of my training as a somatic healer, and there really wasn't one. And I really, like I said, I got into this work because I wanted to create that space, and I saw that there wasn't that space. And so it was what I was longing for. And I decided, well, if it doesn't exist, then I think I have to create it. And it's been actually very healing for me as well, even as a facilitator. I think some of it I noticed, like I was very nervous the first time I ran it. It was at the height of COVID, it was online, and I had really worked hard on the curriculum and like to a ridiculous point. Okay. Really overworked it. And what I noticed is like, oh, none of that really matters. People were so happy to be in a healing space held by an anti-Zionist Jew with other anti-Zionist Jews, where we weren't always necessarily most of the time talking about our politics, but there's an ease to feel like I don't have to because the container is holding that. Sometimes I think when we get into different kinds of Jewish spaces that aren't specifically anti-Zionist, then we feel like fight response in us, or we feel like we have to constantly presence it. And we start to lose like whatever we were hoping to get out of the group when you just have to be the one who's constantly presencing, right? Zionism and anti-Zionism. And so I think what's beautiful about Ruach is that people's defenses come down because you don't have to be the only one, right, of any kind, especially you're definitely not the only anti-Zionist. And so Ruach has really transformed me, and I think is transformative for others because it really shows how we can get together and heal collectively and the power of healing collectively. And one of the things that we do in Ruach is we tell an embodied story from our own lives. And it is a story about our connection to land, whatever that has been, our connection to spirit, our connection to our ancestors. And it's really up to anyone in the course to decide what the content is. But the whole point is that we get to build trust with each other by telling a story that isn't usually told, and people get to see something about us that isn't usually seen. And we get to really try to speak it from our bodies instead of just from our brains. And just that practice has been hugely transformative because people get to grapple with all the ways they may not know anything, like the shame of not knowing any of your Jewish history, or not being brought up religiously, or being brought up what is referred to as, you being too Jewish, you were too religious. And so all of these variations of the shame that we have about our connection to our own Jewishness gets to be held and witnessed and seen. And I think just that piece of our practice is really a beautiful healing practice for people because there aren't a lot of spaces where we want to tell our Jewish stories that are going to be held in a healing way and an anti-Zionist way. There's a lot of different practices we do, but I think that one just popped up as something that I always find really moving and transformative. And I know that people in the group have felt that way because we're getting to do something different and tell new stories, the stories that we want to tell that help us heal, that help us feel held, that help us presence what isn't often presenced.
Thank you so much. That's such an important space to exist. And I think what you said about like being able to be in a space where that's the status quo already relieves so much of the like tension and pressure and defensiveness living in our bodies. And I feel like I had a similar processing around like explicitly identifying in my like professional life as a therapist as like an anti-Zionist therapist, which is
Mhm.
something that I like received a lot of mixed feedback on and have a lot of people tell me is unethical, which thoughts on that. But I did that intentionally because I know what I want out of a therapist. I know what would make me feel safe in a therapeutic space and able to build a therapeutic relationship with someone. And it's for the people who are looking for that. And there are actually so many people who are looking for that and who are looking for people who are working with them on their healing to be transparent about their values and to show up in that way. So I think, especially to have that offering in a group setting for somatic healing is really powerful. And I'm excited for future cohorts of Ruach to exist. I think it's really, really incredible work.
Thank you. And also props to you for coming out as an anti-Zionist therapist. I really like part of why I talk about my own experiences in the book is not because I think they're so unique or important. It's because I think we actually have to break down some of these walls between healers and clients, and not in inappropriate ways, but in ways that humanize all of us. And so I think we need more transparency about who we are in the world, what our own struggles have been, even as we hold healing space for others. And that includes what are our politics. Like, it's very important to so many people to know and then get to make their choice based on that knowing. And we see all the ways that therapy goes wrong when it pretends to be like there's somebody objective, right? Because none of us are. We all are subjective based on our own experiences and our politics and our lives.
I also realized that we didn't even talk about your art, which for me actually is how I knew you before this book came out. Like,
Mm.
I followed your account for quite some time just because I thought you were making like beautiful, powerful artwork that I saw being circulated a lot actually over the last few years. And so I'd love to know a little bit more about your artistic process and how that maybe connects to somatics and your somatic process.
Thank you for that. If I'm not using my hands in a creative way, I don't feel well. And so there's a lot to be said about artistic process, but honestly, I do it because I have to. I think it's in my lineage, like creativity and using your hands to create things. I think that is somehow in me, and I really have to create with my hands to feel okay. So I just do. I make lino cut prints right now. That's my primary artistic practice. And in some ways, I really wanted to create and be part of a thriving Jewish culture beyond Zionism. And I think when I was at the Jewish Voice for Peace national membership meeting, I sold my art, and many people, it was the first time that they got to meet me, or they had bought my art online or seen it online. And it was very emotional for me and for many people seeing it. Like, one person came up and she ended up buying this like crow lino cut that said self-loving anti-Zionist. And she just was like, it's so hard, and started crying. And then I was able to offer a hug and connect. And I want there to be beautiful art that reflects this culture that we're building. And we've been told that this is something that makes us less Jewish or something that's ugly about us. And I want to create these beautiful ways of expressing our culture that we are all creating. And then I also really deeply believe that art can impact us on a very unconscious level too. And so we really want to keep putting out beautiful images that help us imagine the world to come, that help us imagine something different than what we are living into. And I think art does that in a way that is more effective often than talking or words or intellect. It is an embodied practice, and we have an embodied response to something that is moving or beautiful to us. And so I really just, those are the reasons that I love art, because I think it's speaking to us in an unconscious way, it's speaking to us in a body way. And creating art, I feel like I have to do it because I'm not well if I don't, but it's also engrossing and it's part of my resilience practice. So I love making art.
Your art, I think, speaks to a lot of people. And if you're reading this incredible book and you're like, wow, the art in this book is so gorgeous and moving, Wes also did the art in the book. You talk in your book a lot in chapter 6 about this distinction between safety and discomfort,
Mm.
between Judaism and Zionism, between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And in chapter 6 specifically, you're talking about trauma and how trauma impacts our experience of safety. That's exactly what you say. You say it impacts our experience of safety by pulling our attention outside of our bodies.
Mhm.
And ever since reading that, I've been thinking about that so much because, first of all, of course, makes so much sense thinking about trauma and how that shows up in our bodies and in our processing. And I've been noticing like so many instances of people claiming they feel unsafe because of anti-Zionism or because of protest or whatever it may be. And just thinking about how these are all projections of unhealed, unprocessed, unaddressed trauma. And I'm curious, like, when we see people doing this in our day to day, because I think most people listening, us, we're seeing it probably every day. Someone using that statement that they feel unsafe because of someone expressing an anti-Zionist opinion or protesting, whatever it may be, saying that Palestine deserves to be free. Are there ways that we can address that in the moment and hold the reality of the fact that's trauma showing up while also like pushing back against those feelings?
I think it is really tricky because sometimes it's trauma showing up, and obviously that's what I read about in the book. And then sometimes it's trauma being manufactured. And so a lot of times with students on college campuses, I don't think they felt particularly unsafe seeing a Palestinian flag until the ADL came in and told them they should feel unsafe and fed them some lines about it. So I think it's really tricky. So I don't want to say it's always trauma when we say we're feeling unsafe. It's almost just become like an ADL talking point, especially on college campuses. So that's one thing. And then, like, of course, we don't want people to feel unsafe all the time. And we want to keep offering a vision to people of wanting all people to be safe and all people to be free and all people to have self-determination. And so I think there's a way that we can meet someone's concern with curiosity and like, oh, did you feel like you were in physical danger? Why? And I think unpacking a little bit about what it means and also offering a framework that also encountering a different idea than what you believe is not unsafe. And we actually need to be uncomfortable, right? To grow in our lives. And so I think offering a different framework of really working with maybe some of the feelings that are underneath that statement and really finding out what exactly is it, because if it's manufactured, you can find out pretty quickly where it's coming from. And if it's coming from trauma, you can also find out really quickly, right? And then you can figure out, oh, okay, how do I empathize with where this person is coming from and offer a different vision? So I think it's a hard thing to do right now when trauma is being manipulated all over the place and manufactured for certain people. And I think we can still approach with curiosity and empathy, whatever the case is, and also try to offer a different vision of what we can be moving towards and invite people to really feel in their bodies like, are you under some kind of physical threat or are you uncomfortable? Let's learn to differentiate between those two things.
Thank you so much for that answer. That is so helpful in our work as well. As we wind down here, where can listeners read An Anti-Zionist Path to Embodied Jewish Healing?
You can get it anywhere. You can get it at your local library. It's in most libraries. You can get it at your local independent bookstore. If you are living in Seattle, I would go to Elliott Bay Books or I would go to Third Place Books. They've been super supportive of it. So really anywhere that you would buy independent book.
Thank you so much, Wes. This has truly been everything I hoped it would be. I was really excited to get to talk to you about this book and ask some of these questions. And I'm just really excited for this book to be in the world and for us to be embarking on hopefully a new chapter where we're all starting to heal in this way and be able to show up for each other in the world in new ways.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the work you both are doing in the world. And I feel really grateful for this conversation and the thoughtfulness of your questions.
Thanks for listening to Making Mentions. Please consider supporting our work by funding us. You can find the donation link on our website, makingmenches.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Making Menches. We host monthly Shabbats both in person and online, So make sure to sign up for our newsletter, which is on our website, to get updates.
Making Mentions, the podcast, is produced by Alana Lipkin and Jesse Sander. Intro music is by Nate Sander. Editing by Jesse Sander.